When it comes time for Kansas to choose whether it will be free or slave, white settlers will pour into Kansas. Now, many people who support it being a free state will move to Kansas, will bring their families, will make a life there. And in 1855, when they have an election to vote whether to be free or slave, out of the 1,500 citizens who live in Kansas, 6,000 citizens vote. Now, how did that happen? How did you get a 400% voter turnout? Well, what happened is Missouri, who's a slave state, thousands of Missourians travel across the border and show up to vote. And it works like this. You walk up to the polls, and they go, hey, do you live in Kansas? No, I live in Missouri. Well, you can't vote here. Well, I have a gun. And literally, they vote at gunpoint. The slave side wins, not surprisingly, and begins organizing a pro-slave government. The free side, of course, freaks out. They claim this is a bogus election, which it was. They claim that in reality they won, and they begin organizing their own government. Pierce, who had supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, supported popular sovereignty, calls the free government traitors and supports the slave government because the Democratic Party has become more and more aligned with slavery. In Missouri, U.S. Marshals begin to organize posses, and they burn Lawrence, Kansas, to try to wipe out the free government. Because remember, the president has declared the slave government to be the legitimate one. A free soil activist named John Brown and 6 of his followers respond by massacring pro-slave families in a place called Potawatomi, the Potawatomi Massacre. He kills 5. And then all hell breaks loose. Both sides blame each other, and the Civil War begins in Kansas in 1856. You may have heard of Jesse James and Frank James and the Younger Brothers. These are all kind of famous American outlaws that are often looked back on as romantic figures today. In reality, these were teenagers who were organized by a man named Quantrill into a group called Quantrill's Raiders, and they began their career by riding around Kansas and brutally murdering men, women, and children who supported the free soil cause. Quantrill's Raiders and the James and Younger boys were pro-slavery. Later, after bleeding Kansas, they'll become outlaws, and we'll all, I think, end up getting shot. There may be 1 or 2 that live, but most of them get killed because they're doing things like robbing banks. Anyway, this is bleeding Kansas, and it becomes a travesty that the country has to deal with. Now, in May of 1856, Charles Sumner of Massachusetts gives a speech about the crime against Kansas. And in the speech, he says of another representative, Andrew Butler of South Carolina, that he is the Don Quixote of slavery, having chosen a mistress, meaning slavery, who though ugly to others is always lovely to him, though polluted in the sight of the world, is chaste in his sight, the harlot slavery. Now, Butler's cousin, Preston Brooks, will show up to the house a few days later with a steel-tipped cane and begin beating Sumner, who's sitting in a chair that is bolted to the ground, is unable to get up. And will beat him so severely that it will be 4 years before Sumner can take his seat back in the house, and he'll be paralyzed for the rest of his life. Brooks resigns and says, I'll let the voters decide, and is overwhelmingly reelected by voters in South Carolina the next year. Both these men become heroes in their own region, and monsters in the other. So if you go into a southern home during this period, you might see a painting hanging above the fireplace of Brooks beating Sumner, as if this is a point of great southern pride. And of course in the north, it will be the opposite. Sumner will be the hero and Brooks will be the villain. This is a great, very real example of the hatred between the two sides. Let's talk about what the free soilers or the free labor ideals were. They said slavery is not so much bad for blacks. It's really important that we understand that free soilers didn't really care much about black people. Those were abolitionists. This is something a little bit different. They said slavery is bad for whites. They said it prevented whites from advancing. It has stuck them in time. They hadn't modernized. They hadn't moved into a modern economy. They said it preserved an aristocracy, basically what America was trying to escape by creating America. They rejected ideals of individualism and the American dream. They said slavery rejected ideals of individualism, prevented you from pursuing the American dream. And they believed the South was hell-bent on making the North slave as well, meaning expanding slavery into the North. They supported the Union since they needed Southern raw materials. Remember, the North is still largely engaged in textiles, and that meant cotton, and so they need the Southern cotton. So they didn't want to break the Union apart. They just thought that the people in the South were kind of transfixed by this evil institution. The South, of course, was deeply paranoid. Going back to 1831 and Nat Turner's rebellion, William Lloyd Garrison and his constant attacks and criticisms of the South, Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, all these had created a sense of enormous paranoia in the South that the North was coming for their slaves. In 1832, a professor named Thomas Dew of William and Mary in Virginia will write an intellectual defense of slavery. He says slavery is good for everyone. He says Southern blacks are better off than Northern blacks. He says Southern blacks are better off than a lot of Northern whites because, of course, you get food and shelter and clothing on the plantation, unlike Northern whites and Northern blacks who end up doing things like starving to death or dying from exposure because they have nowhere to live. He also explains that the equality of races would lead to violence. One race had to rule the other. You can't have races walking around being equal because they will eventually turn into two teams and go to war against each other. He says the North is getting rich off slave labor too. They buy the cotton. The North seems to like the positive benefits of slave labor, cheap cotton, but they don't seem to like but then they want to criticize it. He called the North hypocrites. He accused the North of being greedy, debaucherous, and destructive. He's talking about the industrialization of the North. He pointed to the Southern stability, paternalistic nature, the honor, the chivalry of the South, and claimed it was a superior society. He claimed a plantation was a better environment for anyone than a factory, and slavery aside, that might be true. He finally argued blacks were biologically inferior and needed to have someone take care of them, that blacks, like women, needed to be protected. And if protected means that we make them do whatever we want, at least they get protected. In 1856, the Democrats will dump Franklin Pierce because he is associated with Bleeding Kansas. And both sides will desperately look for a politician who doesn't have the blood of Kansas on their hands. This is hard to do because pretty much everybody thought popular sovereignty was a great idea. Let me explain why they thought it was a great idea. Because nobody wanted to choose. Nobody wanted to say, I'm pro-slave or I'm anti-slave. And so the idea of giving that responsibility to somebody else sounded wonderful. Of course, it didn't work out. James Buchanan will be nominated by the Democrats because he has the wonderful qualification of having been out of the country. He was in Europe when all this happened, so he had no position on popular sovereignty, so he's the candidate. The Republicans choose John Fremont, that explorer who had helped seize California in the Mexican-American War, because he had been an explorer and a military figure. He had no political record at all, so you couldn't blame Bleeding Kansas on him. This is how politics works. This is everybody looking to not take responsibility. The Native American Party, remember the anti-immigrant party, the Know-Nothings, and the Whigs unite behind Millard Fillmore. The Republicans, who are a brand new party, will run on internal improvements and stopping the expansion of slavery. It's important for you to understand they weren't opposed to slavery, they just didn't want it to expand. Buchanan wins. As you can see, he gets lots and lots of Southern support, but he turns out to be an extremely timid leader, and it does very, very little to try to deal with the problem of slavery. It does not help that the economy takes a downturn during this time. Of course, Northern Democrats, many of them will convert to Republicans, blaming Buchanan for the bad economy.